Hello, everyone. We're going to get started. My name is Deborah Davidson. I'm the director and founder of Catalyst Conversations. I'm so happy to welcome you to a Catalyst Conversation, and I want to thank the List Visual Arts Center for hosting and presenting this program with us. And I especially want to thank Paul Ha and Emily Garner for their continued generosity. Thanks also to the Cambridge Arts Council, our founding partner, our board, and all our volunteers who help us out, and to those of you who have donated recently. Catalyst Conversations was founded to open a critical path for dialogue between the arts and sciences. We present intimate and provocative conversations between artists, scientists, and the public, and we're interested in connecting the two through programs, educational outreach, and public events like this, which demonstrate the important conversation and synergy between art, science, and technology. This evening's topic is Beyond Reach on understanding physics. And the important question here is, how does a physicist grapple with understanding the physical world that is beyond the reach of ordinary human perception? Kaća Bradonjić, a physicist and visual artist, is fascinated with this and approaches this question by focusing on subjective internal experiences that help researchers ground their scientific understanding. Often dreamlike, transient, and elusive, such experiences are rarely acknowledged in the formal presentation of scientific work, yet are an integral part of the research process. During her artist residency at the Institute for Artificial Intelligence and Fundamental Interactions at MIT, she collaborated with physicists to capture those experiences in an artistic form, guided by philosophy of phenomenology, embodied theories of cognition, and history of science. Tonight, Kaća is joined by theoretical physicist Tracy Slatyer and physicist and historian of science David Kaiser to reflect on the experience of collaborative work, the role of subjective experience in scientific process, and its relationship to the collective scientific efforts. Kaća is a visual artist and assistant professor of physics at Hampshire College. Crossing the border of science, philosophy, and art, her work explores how various ways in which we experience, understand, and emotionally connect with the world affect our pursuit of knowledge. Tracy Slatyer is a theoretical physicist who works on particle physics, cosmology, and astrophysics. Her research is motivated by questions of fundamental particle physics, in particular, the nature and interactions of dark matter. But she seeks answers to these questions by studying possible signatures of new physics in astrophysical and cosmological data. She is co-discoverer of the giant gamma-ray structures known as Fermi bubbles erupting from the center of the Milky Way. David Kaiser is the author of several award-winning books about modern physics, including How the Hippies Saved Physics, Science, Counterculture, and the Quantum Revival, and Quantum Legacies, Dispatches from an Uncertain World. Kaiser's physics research focuses on early universe cosmology, working at the interface of particle physics and gravitation. He also helped design and conduct novel experiments to explore the foundations of quantum theory. So with that, Kaća will begin, and then we'll be joined with David and Tracy over here.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, everyone who came today. I'm a little apprehensive, but also excited to share the work that I've been doing for the last year. So hopefully, I'm going to try to keep this at 15 minutes so that we have more time for conversation. So most of what I'm going to tell you about here are snippets of something you can find in an article that is coming out in Leonardo, but it's available as a preprint called The Phenomenal Atlases of Contemporary Physics, Knowing the Imperceptible. So I'm going to just kind of highlight some ideas. To give you a sense of my academic trajectory, I have a bachelor's in physics and philosophy from Northeastern, and then I went on to BU to get a PhD in general relativity, which is mostly theoretical work. And then I got my first job out of grad school was a teaching post at Wellesley College, where I was for 4 years. And then I moved on to Hampshire College, where I have been now for 7 years. So a lot of what I'm doing here is also informed by my teaching. The first project that I did that incorporated sort of science and physics in particular and my artistic practice was a project called Projections, where I would go to scientific conferences and then try to make small postcard-size artwork that was somehow capturing the essence of the talk. And that was really exciting. It's kind of, it eased me into improvising because I would have to finish it within the 45 minutes. It was very public, so people would see what I'm doing. I thought of it as a collaborative piece by me and the speaker, so both of us would sign in the back. And it was sort of the project that kind of led me to the thing that I'm going to talk about today. It took me a while to figure out how to formulate the essential thing that's driving me, and so I tried many different formulations, but the essential thing, I guess, I kind of rephrased this in an Uber ride over, because I kept trying different things. But I want to make a premise that scientific research is at a fundamental level an activity by which a human being, a person, constructs their understanding of the physical world. So we can talk about science as sort of a general pursuit, methodology, and so on. We can talk about epistemology, but essentially there is no science unless there is a human being doing the science. And so I want to know, what is that experience? What is that subjective experience of doing science? Because we don't give, in science we tend to push subjective aside. It's uncomfortable. We don't know how it impacts our research. We'd like to retain this feeling of objectivity, I'd say, but this internal subjective experience is still integral to the scientific pursuit. So some of the texts that inspired me were actually from continental philosophy tradition, which is not what I was studying, but one author in particular is Maurice Merleau-Ponty. So I'm going to read just a few excerpts from his works, which really encapsulate one of the key ideas which I'm working with. The scientific thinking, a thinking which looks on from above and thinks of the object in general, must return to there is which underlies it, to the site, the soil of the sensible and open world, such as this in our life and for our body. Not that possible body which we may legitimately think of as an information machine, but that actual body I call mine, the sentinel standing quietly at the command of my words and my acts. Further, associated bodies must be brought forward along with my body, the others, not merely as my congeners, as the zoologists say, but the others who haunt me, and when I haunt and I haunt them, I guess, the others, along with whom I haunt a single present and actual being, as no animal ever haunted those beings of his own species, locale, or habitat. I do want to say that he points out an important thing, is that there is individual scientists, but then there's also how we come together, and how do we talk about our work, and how do we relate to each other. So as a visual artist, I kind of had to come up with a visual statement of the problem here. And so I'm going to walk you through it. So I'm going to start out as a human being, a sensing, feeling human being. And here I'm using I as a symbol of that because I am a visual artist. But when I think about this work, I think about art in general. And then there's the phenomenal. So that is our experience of the world, the first person experience that we have through our senses. And it's wild and it's messy, and we kind of impose some structure on it. But it could include also, I would like to think of it as including not only the sensory input, but also all the feelings, emotions that we have in response to that. And then there is the imperceptible aspect of the physical world, which as physicists we try to understand. And then the goal of scientific work is actually to achieve a certain knowledge of this imperceptible thing. Okay, so we would like to know. And then my question is this: how does a person ground their scientific understanding of the physical world in the sensory impressions and emotional states made possible by their body? Right? How do I, who have never seen a black hole, an elementary particle, or an infinite series, right, apart from some representation of it, grapple with those things in my work? Okay. So to sort of emphasize the same point coming from Maurice Merleau-Ponty, he says, all my knowledge of the world, even my scientific knowledge, is gained from my own particular point of view or from some experiences of the world without which the symbols of sciences would be meaningless. The whole universe of science is built upon the world as directly experienced, and if we want to subject science itself to rigorous scrutiny and arrive at a precise assessment of its meaning and scope, we must begin by reawakening the basic experience of the world, of which science is the second-order expression. So one sort of easy go-to when one thinks about internal models, or the visual internal models, and there's an extensive literature on this in all of the sciences, so I don't want to spend too much time on that. That's something you can go and read about. What I'm interested goes a little bit beyond that, so not just the visual, but what are the other parts of this internal subjective experience of a scientist? So to kind of figure out what that might be, I looked around and I found a book that my PhD advisor gave me a long time ago and that I put on a bookshelf and never looked at again. And it is a book by a mathematician, a French mathematician, Jacques Hadamard. It's called The Psychology of Invention in the Mathematical Field. He himself was a practicing mathematician and a very successful one, but he was very curious about the process, the psychology of mathematical invention. And here I have sort of 4 book covers. The book came out in 1945, I think it was Princeton University Press. Then it was picked up by Dover in 54, and I think there are a couple of editions of Dover because they're different covers. I have the 3rd one, but in purple. And in 1996, Princeton University Press published another version of it. So there is something to this book that still appeals to people, I believe. And so, just to quote Hadamard himself, he says, "I wish to understand what takes place in my own mind when I undertake to build up or to comprehend a mathematical argument. I insist that words are totally absent from my mind when I really think, and that even after reading or hearing a question, every word disappears at the very moment I'm beginning to think it over. Words do not reappear in my consciousness before I have accomplished or given up the research." Okay? So what he's telling us, basically, when he's doing the work, words are not there, right? He has to translate that in the end. And the book is interesting because he really tried to undertake a study. So he had a very long questionnaire that he distributed to a lot of mathematicians and scientists, and then he documents some of the response that he has. They went as far as like, where do you sit when you work, right? Or did you play an instrument when you were young? And what's interesting about the book is that not only are there are sort of visual thinkers, but there are people who talk about thinking in terms of rhythms. You know, when they think of words, they don't think of their meaning, but sort of the cadence that they have. And then he also sent, there's another quote by him. He says, "I think also it's essential to emphasize that I behave in this way not only about words, but even about algebraic signs. I use them when I'm dealing with easy calculations, but whenever the matter looks more difficult, they become too heavy a baggage for me. I use concrete representations, but of quite different nature." Now, he also recruited Einstein. He sent him a letter, and Einstein kindly responded, and I thought this was a good example because it shows just the sort of diversity of experiences. So Einstein says, "The words or the language, as they are written or spoken, do not seem to play any role in my mechanism of thought. The psychical entities which seem to serve as elements in thought are certain signs and more or less clear images which can be voluntarily reproduced and combined. The above-mentioned elements are, in my case, of visual and some of muscular type. Conventional words or other signs have to be sought for laboriously only in secondary stage when the mentioned associated play is sufficiently established and can be reproduced at will. There is, of course, a certain connection between those elements and relevant logical concepts. It is also clear that the desire to arrive finally at logically connected concepts is the emotional basis of this rather vague play with the above-mentioned elements. But taken from a psychological viewpoint, this combinatory play seems to be the essential feature in productive thought, before there is any connection with logical construction in words or other kinds of signs which can be communicated to others." So this is a pretty strong claim. Now, I teach physics. I teach, I teach general introduction to physics. Sometimes I teach advanced topics to non-scientists. And even the simplest classes, you know, when I do mechanics and we do kinematics equations, and I'm doing these, you know, I'm solving a problem, I'm taking a derivative, and I'm telling them how to solve the problem. But really what's happening in my mind is a whole other set of things. And then, you know, when students ask me, how do you become a physicist? What's the process like? You know, this is what Einstein says. I can't teach that. This is not something that I'm even fully aware of in myself, right? So this book really was sort of influential in how I approached this project. So that then led me on to think about what is cognition in the first place, and so I stumbled upon these theories of embodied cognition. So the mainstream theory of cognition is that says that mind is sort of like an information processing machine that is abstract abstract information gets processed in a particular way. The theories of embodied cognition, of which there are many, say that really our full body is involved in processing information. So it's not some manipulation of some abstract symbols, but for example, if you're thinking of a wave, you might be recalling the last wave you saw or some childhood memory of a wave or a landscape of some sort. And there's actually quite a lot of research of this in the educational context. So some of the examples are the role of embodied cognition for transforming learning, learning and expertise with scientific external representations, and embodied and extended cognition model. I think my favorite study is where they put a bunch of physics students in functional MRI and asked them to think about various concepts, and they tried to kind of map which regions of the brain were responding and how they were related to other things. So Tracy is telling me that it's 5 minutes, so I'm gonna do this last bit. So just reading these accounts from Hadamard's book and learning about embodied cognition, I realized that according to these embodied theories of cognition, these experiences are personal, subjective, and they're not necessarily only visual, and they can't even be explained in words. And so I thought, what better way to actually try to capture them than through art, right? And so, because words are limited, and in the words of Eric Fromm, is that the words are vessels that are filled with experience that overflows the vessels. The words point to an experience, but they're not the experience. And then the title of my project is the Phenomenal Atlases. And so for that, I'm not going to read the quote, but I will just tell you there's this amazing book called Objectivity by historians of science Lorraine Daston and Peter Gallison, which is really, it's about objectivity, subjectivity, but mostly about images that people use in science and how they're used to sort of ground us and connect us. And so I like this idea of, where is the good quote that I picked up? It says, where the atlases display crystals or cloud chamber traces, brain slices or galaxies, they still aim to map the territory of the sciences they serve. They are the guides to all practitioners, consult time and time again to find what is worth looking at, how it looks, and perhaps most important of all, how it should be looked at. And so I thought, wouldn't it be great if I could have a phenomenal atlas of working objects of practicing physicists in various sort of lines of research. So my first art residency was at the NSF Institute for Artificial Intelligence for Fundamental Interactions. There's an I missing in a title, which is at MIT. And they were kind enough to give me an office with the most amazing view that I've ever had. So that's on a top view. My office, halfway through the residency, which was 4 months long, is on a bottom, so it's filled with lots of things. And what we see in the middle are the videos of 3 researchers that are telling me about their work, sketching stuff, and actually making art instruments out of various office objects, which was an activity that I tried to use to ease them into the project. And so I have 2 works in progress I'm going to show you. And they were done based on the conversations with David Kaiser. So this is the first one. I called it Primordial Black Hole. I don't know if that was appropriate. And so David can tell you a little bit about how what this actually means. I've never seen it this big. It's about 28 by 20 inches. Deborah, you can ask me why I chose pastels later on, so they're oil pastels. But we started with some sketches. David drew some sketches. And then I made some, I understood what he wanted to do, and so then I made some sort of samples, and they weren't quite right. So Dave came back to my office, and I said, Dave, here's a piece of chalk, there's a table, can you please sketch something? So if you zoom in, he sketched something for me, and then I asked questions like, where's the light coming from when you see these things? And they made a smaller sketch, and eventually we came with a big one. The second one that's also work in progress is this one, which we just kind of named Code for Early Universe Injection of Photons by Dark Matter by Tracy Slatyer. This was a cause of a lot of pain, suffering, and anxiety, and continues to be so. It's still work in progress. I spent last week tirelessly working at this thing. But these are some notes that I took when Tracy and I were talking. So we had 2 in-person meetings, I believe. And we can tell you more about the process itself, but they sort of evolved. Then I had one sketch done with colored pencils that I thought was kind of, useful. And then eventually I kind of built it up to the big one you just saw, and it was a lot of emails of going back and forth. One closing thing I will say before we move on to conversation is that what I realized in the process that this project, at its essence, is really this creation of phenomenal atlases. It's neither art in service of science nor science in service of art. Really, it's a collaboration through which two people embark on the search for deeper understanding of what it means to know oneself, another, and the physical world. Because as we went through this process, it became clear that there are certain parts of our internal lives that are integral to the work that we do that we actually don't even know we are having unless somebody asks us to actually look at it. And there's a step when you're talking to another person, you're trying to communicate that. Like, how do I, as an artist, try to understand what's going on in Tracy's mind? Like, what is that? And the content of all of this was understanding the physical world itself. So I'm going to end with that, and maybe we can go deeper during the conversation. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm going to start with something that people who have attended Catalyst may have heard me say before, which is paraphrasing something that novelist and physicist Alan Lightman said to me once. Both art and science need metaphor to start something new. But at some point, science needs to go beyond metaphor, and art can stay within the metaphor. So the question is, how do you experience that? I think in your talk, Kaća, you kind of explicated this repeatedly. So anyone to follow up?
David and Tracy or me?
Any of you.
Well, I want to say that, people talk about physical theories and models as sort of metaphors, right? So we have some, we have a theory, we can think of it as a metaphor, we test it, adjust it, and so on. I think what I'm aiming here is not this collective metaphor. I want to know what is the internal subjective one, and how does that help me grapple with this abstract thing that I have never seen, will never experience. And then how do I even communicate that to somebody else who's trying to grapple with the same thing? So what is the common ground, right? What does it really mean to have this feeling, the experience of understanding something, right? And so I think there's a distinction there between metaphors, physical theories as metaphors, and this sort of internal
I guess
structures we build.
Maybe I can offer something. Yes, so this quote to me made me think of something related, which is how we talk about building physical intuition in physics classes, and that's again a situation where we want people to build an intuitive sense of how things work, and at some point you need to go beyond the intuition and sit down and do some calculations if you want to make concrete predictions. But it's very much easier to figure out what kind of calculation you should be doing and to realize if things are going badly wrong in your calculation if you have that intuition underlying it. So when I taught undergrad special relativity, and I think also in undergraduate quantum mechanics classes, there are concepts that are very counterintuitive the first time you hit them, and sort of figuring out how to build an intuition to deal with these non-everyday situations is sort of an important step. And I feel like what your artwork is about in figuring out, okay, what's actually going on inside our heads when we think about these concepts is part of the picture of how that intuition gets built up.
Yeah, just to jump in, I think, Kaća, that what you're doing is, for me, so interesting, which is, I don't know anyone who's doing what you're doing, number one, but that you're really interested in your own experience, and then the kind of collaboration, or how that intersects with maybe what David's working on. I mean, it's very, it's kind of an act of generosity in a certain way.
I agree, and I would just say along these lines, the metaphor, whether for an experienced practitioner or for a learning student, the metaphors don't stay static. And so your emphasis, Kaća, which I really find fascinating, on subjective experience. Experience is unfolding over time as well. Our own discussions unfolded over time. My own thinking and that of my close colleagues who are also here and hopefully can enjoy the view of our work on the big screen, that our own thinking has certainly not been static. And I think we've had to come back time and time again in the kind of cycle, Tracy, you were describing, of we have a series of ideas that we can sort of articulate at a whiteboard, not nearly so fantastically as Kaća can do, But the
Joint
artistic skills,
work, Dave. There was joint work.
joint work, we did together. I didn't do that part. I mean, let me be clear. I wish I could. And then it's going to refine our own thinking and our calculations. They're going to refine how we make sense of the calculations. Then we're going to be adjusting the metaphor. I don't think we shed the metaphors. I think the metaphors move along as well. When they get refined, they shift. We might drop one altogether. But and so anyway, I did that element of sort of over timeness, I think, is also emphasized by your focus on the Merleau-Ponty and the internal experience. So.
I told Deborah to ask me why I chose pastels. First of all, it's because I couldn't do oil because I didn't have a proper studio and you needed ventilation. And the oil pastels were the closest. But one of the things which was also good is that, and this was repeatedly happening when I was doing interviews, I said, I don't know, how do you think of this thing? I don't know, primordial black hole. And he said, sometimes I think of it this way, sometimes I think of it that way. Sometimes it's a context dependent. So these things change. And so there's sort of, I was like, just tell me, what are you thinking about it right now? Like, I want to know, what is it right now? And so some of these internal representations are permanent, not permanent, but they're like more persistent, so they last over the course of a project. Sometimes they're just like, Tracy's has like a little part of the code has puzzles, and I remember you telling me like, I don't know why I came up with puzzles, maybe because I played puzzles yesterday. But they're kind of elusive, they're dreamlike, you can't quite catch them, they're changing, which is one of the reasons I chose oil pastels, because you cannot do very kind of fine line, straight line work. You think you can, and you can use masking tape, but then it gets smudged, which is really frustrating. But I think it really encapsulates this sort of another layer of this, that like these things are not firm, they're gonna last. I can spray it with something over, when I'm done with it, but it's sensitive and it's gonna, smudge and.
Yeah.
They kind of never dry. I mean, they're like always becoming something, which is a good analogy, I think, to
I mean,
what you're both doing here.
Suddenly, like my side of that experience was indeed when Kaća started asking me, how do you think about this? There were some elements that were sort of very clear and distinct, mostly because I had used that idea to make an actual plot that had to go into the paper, so that had sort of gotten solidified. But there were other things where she would say, so how do you think about this? And I'd be like, oh, wait, I need to think about that. And that was partly a process of discovery, like sort of thinking about, okay, what was going on behind the scenes. But I feel like it was also sort of a process of collaborative creation. Like the way that I thought about this changed during our conversations in some ways. Some things got more distinct.
So one of the reasons I asked David and Tracy to join me today is because that was the longest sort of collaboration. So we had 2 in-person meetings, and then I bothered both of them with emails. This is the updated work. What do you think? But I remember with Tracy early on. So I wrote this in the Leonardo article. It's like you have a meeting with a person, they tell you something. So I would ask all sorts of things. What are the shapes? What are the colors? Which green? That green? This green? And then sometimes people would give me things that my aesthetic sense would just be like, I can't put those 2 things next to each other. And then I had this internal struggle, like where is the balance between staying truthful to the internal representation of this person and still making it look good as, in my view. So Tracy's like, yours is like, I'm really struggling with that purple and with that lemon yellow,
So incidentally, that was because, like dark matter, so this is a metaphor, right? It's not actually dark. Like when we say dark matter, we mean something that is transparent. The light goes to it.
Right.
But I have used the words dark matter for long enough that when my brain has to visualize dark matter, it paints it dark purple. And whereas light, my brain has decided is lemon yellow, despite the fact that the light in the part of time of the universe that we're thinking about is not, in fact, yellow. That is not the right wavelength. But this is how my brain represents
and then over time, those yellow blotches, they were like immiscible fluids, And then I was like, what does that look like? So I had to Google immiscible fluids and then find something that looked good. But Tracy's is interesting because we really went back and forth. And so she hadn't seen the latest version. At some point, she stopped responding to my emails because she was busy traveling, and I was like, I need the answer now, like it's in front of me. But she just saw it today, so I added some things like the bluish kind of outlines of things. That's mine.
I'm sorry I missed your email. I wasn't deliberately failing to respond. It must have just come in.
At some point, I feel like I'm so grateful that you actually take the time.
Well, I'm really happy with how it turned out.
David, do you want to talk about, there was one thing that I really want to mention, more than 3 is 8.
Oh, yes, right.
Yes, so.
Yeah. These are not just primordial black holes, as I'm sure you could tell from the. These are hypothetical objects that could have what we call color charge. And so the physicists, even, as many of you know, you even use the word color, though much like Tracy's saying, it doesn't mean maybe like with dark matter, which is not dark. Color is another metaphor, an analogy that's become kind of ingrained for roughly 50 years. And then what becomes very important is how many distinct colors are there, which again doesn't really mean a Crayola box of 24 versus 64 crayons, whatever. There's a very specific kind of mathematical mapping when we describe things like quarks and the other particles that quarks can interact with, like gluons. Anyway, so for these kinds of black holes that Elba, Alonso Monsalve, and I have been thinking about for a long time, they should come in one of 8 different varieties. 8 recognizably different colors in a mathematical space. It really means they live in a mathematical space with 8 dimensions, which I won't try to draw either. And it really doesn't actually matter what colors one uses, that Kaća uses. We just wanted to have more than 3 of them, and if you got 4 or 5 or 6 distinct colors, we could call that 8. So we have this little shorthand saying, anything more than 3 is 8, which is not good arithmetic, right? But artistically, it saves the need of saying, well, do I use this brown or that tan, right? Just a variety that's going to be clearly more than only 3, because they're not quarks, they're gluons, but I cared about that. I didn't care if is it literally 8 distinct recognizable colors, but just a sea of them. And the other part that I really love is that, which I think Kaća captures so well with this, among many things.
I'm still not done with it.
Has so far, they unfold in time, as we said, has so far captured so well, is that over longer and longer distances, the color should sort of wash out. It should be nondescript. No particular color should stand out, and there should basically be a kind of gray or without clear color. And I love the use of the perspective, the kind of imagined distant horizon, where as you get further and further from the action close up front, the color splotches of at least 4, 5, or 6, or 7, 8 different colors, they should kind of wash out. And anyway, so I love that Kaća was able to build that into the representation as well. Yeah.
I gotta say, there are those panic moments. I don't know how much time we have, but before we ask for questions. But so I have recorded video interviews, and then I have some audio interviews. And so it's been, I think we finished interviews like in January last year. Yeah. So, but whenever I go back to work on them, I play them. So Tracy talks in the background. And even though Tracy is not necessarily describing which purple and which yellow, but I have her voice. And I did the same thing with you, and then at some point I was listening to it, but I was making these really plump balloon-like things. Yeah. And you said, oh, this should be flat. And, oh, I'm hitting my mic. And I was like, oh no, I've done this whole thing, and it's all like, they're like balloons. Right. And then we messaged, and I kind of went back to another conversation where this kind of evolved, right? Mm-hmm. And then he would tell me, like, they're kind of like balloons, but they're fuzzy. There's like fire on the edges. I was like, how do I make balloons that have fire on the edges?
So they should have a typical scale, they're not all exactly this size. There's a kind of shorter, again, a kind of rippling effect at the edges, which maybe the pastels capture better than other media. Yeah.
But it was like, there was like, after all this work, so today I showed Tracy the picture, and there's a graph inside, and then I looked at the index card notes, and the graph that she drew is not the graph that I have there. I was like, oh no. Luckily, it's small.
But it's a good graph. I mean, it's actually it's one of the things that I have in. Yeah, no, it's good. It's one of the things that I have in mind when thinking about this. I may have drawn a different sample, but that one is good.
Okay, good. But it's very sort of this iterative process of back and forth, and it's been very rewarding.
Yeah.
So I have a question for both of you, which is, have you, before your collaboration with Kaća, have you done your own visualization of your research, even if it's rudimentary or just stick figures or something? Right. I'm just curious if your own interest or ability to visualize your work.
Do you want to go first?
I tend not to be very. I don't default to the visual, at least not as much as some of our colleagues do. And so I tend to try to scribble, algebra, and then we can pause and make rudimentary things like a circle here and a line there. We have colleagues, we all have colleagues with whom I work very closely who are immensely deeply visual thinkers. And often it's the work just to kind of connect, actually, saying, I stayed up all night, here's my 12 pages of algebra, and I'm thinking of Alan Guth will do this, Well, I see it this way. Is it? What do you mean you see it that way? I mean, you know, it's in 9 dimensions. You don't see it. And so there's a variety of styles, let's put it that way. And I am on one end of that particular spectrum.
Yeah, I guess for me, there are certain, the most regular case in which we need to convert work into a visual form is in terms of thinking about how to make a plot that is informative. Or in the work that Kaća's painting is based on, that's actually this code package, which one of my students in the audience knows in great detail, for figuring out how if dark matter collides and produces photons in the early universe, how those photons would affect the evolution of the early universe. And in the course, and that code is pretty complicated and it has a lot of moving parts. And there was a point in one of these papers where I was like, oh God, I am losing track of all the moving parts. I need to figure out how to visually depict how this code works and like which pieces feed into which other pieces so that I can just look at the whole thing and keep the whole thing in my mind. And that plot is one of the is one of the things that I had fixed firmly in my mind because I had to spend all this time figuring out how to depict it in a clear way, that my students had also spent some time trying to figure out how to depict it in a nice way. So that was sort of part of the fixed part of my visualization. But I guess the other thing that I might say here that I thought was really interesting is in particle physics, a framework that we use very regularly for organizing calculations is the framework of Feynman diagrams, which is very diagrammatic and visual. And they show up in a lot of the artwork that Kaća did. And it didn't have to be this way. Like everything that you draw in terms of a Feynman diagram, you can do with pages of algebra instead. But the Feynman diagram method allows us to organize those pages of algebra in a way that for many people is much more intuitive once you build the intuition. And so it's just this ubiquitous method in the field. And it's become a visual language that connects particle theorists, such that when I looked at the other artworks that Kaća had drawn, there were lots of cases where I would look at it and be like, yeah, I know what this means. Like it's somebody else's internal visualization, but I recognize elements of it, I recognize aspects of it, and I can go, okay, I know what physics this is talking about. So it was interesting to me both how individual things are, but also that there were these elements of a common language, in particular Feynman diagrams that
so
are
one of the reasons I'm interested in this is that because like Feynman diagrams, Faraday's depiction of electromagnetic fields in terms of lines, those all are sort of standard practice now. But they came from a single person's imagination. And so I'm interested in why is it that some of these internal representations make it into the collective? Why do some not? You have written a whole book on sort of genesis and origin of Feynman diagrams and how they travel around the world. What do they even mean, you know? And so I think it's worth exploring. I do want to say that as a visual artist, I'm focused on a visual, but I'm thinking of this framework as being very broad. Like there were so when I did the interviews, the first person I interviewed is in the audience here. And when he told me about what he was doing, I was like, this has to be a poem. Like it can't be a visual piece. So I think my hope is that people start to think about this more broadly. What is the fullness of experience that one has? Maybe a performance, dance performance, maybe a musical piece, or maybe it's something else. We focus on the visual because that sort of dominates the field itself. And for me, it's my way of representation. But I think there is more, it's much richer experience than just the visual.
Yes. Some years ago, for the 100th anniversary of Einstein's general theory of relativity, which I think if you take a snap vote, we all love it, great. I was able to work with an amazing team of scientists and artists and communicators and educators. And one of the things we were able to do is actually stage a short dance piece, essentially a ballet, to try to evoke, if not explain, how LIGO works, how the the laser interferometric gravitational wave observer. And it really is all about sort of bodies moving through space and time, and there's an ordering to it, and this happens there, and that leads to that there. So I don't know if choreographers would find it a great success. I thought it was fantastic to have professional dancers working for quite a while in conversation, much like what you've been doing here. Say, how do we evoke all kinds of phenomena about the world?
Just curious, was that John Bohannon was the choreographer? Do you remember?
No. I don't think it was. I can't remember who it was, but I don't think it was.
Because John Bohannon dances science.
Yeah. And now there are sonifications. I mean, things like think about gravitational waves. A lot of these are very specific kind of frequency changing patterns, and that's what musical instruments do. So we do when we sing, and so people have gotten very good at not only for the sake of that sounds cute, but does that lead, much like the Feynman diagrams, does that generate new questions by engaging with other senses or something beyond sort of merely the algebraic? Oh, I never even thought of that. Now let me use other modes of trying to ask and question and evaluate. And so can it be generative and not just representational?
It's interesting, though, that sonification has not, it's mostly done for sort of general public to illustrate a point. It hasn't really made it fully, it's not as mainstream as visual representation.
Yes.
In science. I think it's interesting to explore why that is.
Yes, yeah, I have a very dear friend on the faculty here who's an anthropologist, Stefan Helmreich, who's talked with a lot of our local LIGO colleagues. And he says sometimes internally they'll use sonifications just as a kind of form of calibration. Is the system locked? And they've learned how to hear a certain signal, which is different than just watching, kind of Fourier transforms. So it has some, it's not merely a fun external facing representation. And maybe there'll be more opportunities beyond that too, yeah.
I did think, though, that as an external-facing representation, the sonification for LIGO was a really nice way to get across that this is actually a new way of understanding the universe beyond the electromagnetic spectrum, in the sense that it's like a new sense for our telescopes.
Yeah.
So I'm just looking at the clock. Be very happy to invite audience members to comment or ask questions. So putting that out there, if anyone, yes. And I think
You want to take
We
the
have a
microphone?
microphone.
we have a mic.
Yeah.
Do we have the extra mic?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Wow. Well, with the microphone, this better be a really good question. Okay. So this is for Kaća. Are you familiar with the Iranian mathematician Maryam Mirzakhani?
I know of her,
Okay.
but not much.
Okay, so she developed these really extraordinary sketches and doodles as part of her work, and I'd love to hear somebody with your perspective on it, but maybe next time you come back.
I'll look her up, yeah, I'm curious.
Her, just as a side note, her toddler daughter could really relate to them.
Another question. Right.
Yeah.
It's great to hear you think aloud and move into other senses. I have a tough one for you, which is the massive increase in a kind of quasi-photographic visualization from data, right? You know what I'm talking about. Where do you place the body in relationship to that? Because in my outsider's view of that process of generating the first photograph of the black hole, the group dynamic was that different groups of humans were turned into kind of generative antagonistic networks in order to make sure they could trust the, quote, photographic, and I've had arguments about whether it's a photograph or not. It is, according to the Museum of Modern Art. How do you want to think about that in relationship to the body, where these bodies have to agree, or it's not science? I don't know if that question makes sense, but
It does
it's
make
it's
sense.
very much a departure from the individual body and their intuitions about the black hole and their kind of, I mean, I love this idea of training intuition because, you know, again, to move, as Tracy said, from the counterintuitive to something as fabulously counterintuitive as the black hole, right? I'm just fascinated to put the actual successful canonical picture, or for that matter, the sonification of the first LIGO detection, you know, into the room, because these are claims to be indexical, veridical pictures or sounds of data speaking itself.
So one thing that came to mind is I know there was a really elaborate way to ensure that whatever was produced matched, right? So there wasn't one thing. I think that was sort of, to me, that's almost a symbolic, sort of representation of like this almost neurotic urge to be as objective as possible in the process and not to read into it. And I think it's necessary at that kind of collective stage. But I don't know, I think I would say the researchers, once they produce the image, each person comes with their own sort of history when they take a look at it. And there is a thing that we say to each other within a setting of like a group meeting, within a conference meeting, within a text. And I think there are different stories that people tell depending whom they're talking to. I wouldn't call it a picture. I don't know if you wanted to know. I don't think it's a photograph. I think it's a representation of data in a particular way. But I'm not sure. I think each of I can't speak for the people, but I think all of us come with a particular expectation and sort of, you can call it a baggage, but you can also call it a lens with which we look at that. And then that's a private experience. And then we have this, what is it that we can actually say in a conversation with others? And I think we're still sort of not comfortable saying what we think or what our experiences are when we're with others.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that answered it or not. But that's sort of where I went with it.
That's what I will say. I mean, it's interesting, right? Because at some level, you're right here. Is it a photograph or is it a representation of data in a particular way? Well, in some sense, photographs are also representations of data in a particular way, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's the light that was hitting your camera lens reflected from objects out there. So, they're all interpretations at some level. But this also seems to me to maybe relate to your earlier quote about science, transitioning from metaphor to beyond metaphor. In situations like this, everyone has a picture in their head of how black holes work, and for some people that's Penrose diagrams, and for some people that's like a ball on a sheet, and for some people it's a bunch of equations. But I guess the question of, okay, but like what do the light rays look like from the region around the event horizon? That's something that you can try to gain consensus on, and everyone comes to it from their own intuitive picture and their own metaphors. But I guess there is an objective thing that you can try to get agreement.
And it also seems that we as human beings are driven to like want to know something, like what is it? Is it true, essentially? And so we rely on scientists and thinkers to answer that for us in a way,
But
I speak as a layperson, so.
Never having complete certainty. But.
I agree, and never really starting from scratch. So starting from a set of, I think you're saying, expectations or assumptions or habits, or conventions for representing certain kinds of things. So the black hole photograph looks like a photograph not by accident. There's a whole series of choices about not just the color palette, but the framing, the angle, and much as like when Kaća asked me for these so far only imagined objects, where do I see the light coming from? Oh, I hadn't even thought about what's the viewer's point of view on perspective, and I think that's we don't shed that when we also make our sonifications or our fancy large team group visualizations like from the Event Horizon Telescope. So we're doing it with a set of conventions and genres, some of which we might not have recognized at the time.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. Do you think we're aware when we're making those choices
Not
that
always.
we made them, right?
Sometimes, but I wouldn't say always. Yeah. And I don't think that's bad. And that's not to say that therefore it's all made up or not to be trusted. What else would we do?
Hi, I'm an artist who works with scientists of different kinds and humanists and others, but the question you asked made me want to we often talk about metaphor, but as artists, we really think about representation, and working with scientists, we think about scientists as also being engaged in a practice of representation, and that the representation is our best approximation to understand the world that we actually inhabit. And so when you think in that way, and the book by Daston and Gallison really talks about that what we think of as objective reality or as representations of objectivity is a complete historical construct. Before that, we thought differently about truth, and the enrollment of photography into the definition of what was real was a very specific time in history, and we're no longer in that time. We're still constructing new ways of representing the world, and it's an unfolding thing, as you've so beautifully said. And so I wanted to ask you, if you agree with that, would you consider a value in having artists or other practitioners, not necessarily, I think the art science thing is great, but I think in the dialogue between disciplines and cultures, we're basically bringing different points of view, different representational frameworks to the table. And so could you imagine having labs in which you would have not just scientists or not just physicists? I mean, scientists tend to collaborate with each other, sometimes with great difficulty, but people who might help together open up the space of representation so that it can move. And so I'm just curious, in the initial collaboration between you, whether it makes you want to go towards more, or whether you'd like to close the door and go back into your own body and mind. And you don't have to answer yes. You could say, no, I really want to.
Is that a question for them or for me?
I mean, for all of you, because often artists often turn towards scientists and represent science. And I think in order, this is a personal view, but in order for our culture to move forward, we actually need to construct these meta-disciplinary objects. I mean, I think we do that in any case, but I'm just curious. Sorry.
No, so I will just say that basically my primary audience is the physicists, really. So I can make these pictures and I can show them to you, and you might find them inspiring, exciting, pretty, not pretty, whatever that might be. But I really care about what David and Tracy went through. I'm interested in how we both changed in the process. I would like physicists, I mean, that's sort of my field, so I'm focusing on that. But I also talk to, geologists and biologists. But to become more introspective, right? Like, I think there's a value in introspection in general, but particularly in the sciences, not only about how am I thinking about these things and what is the process, but also things like, what is the future of this work going to be? How might it be applied? Maybe some good things, maybe some bad things, But just being generally more self-aware, and instead of sort of pretending that one is objective, actually acknowledging the subjectivity in all its forms and being more aware of it so that it doesn't get in a way when you actually want to get to the truth, whatever that may be, or an accurate model, right? And I think there is a place for this. I think there's a need for it. I think it's important for education when physicists talk to each other about what is it they're thinking, but also we're trying to train new physicists, new scientists, to be more honest about what actually scientific work is in practice, and to do that, you actually have to know what's going on in your head. So I hope to continue this work, and I hope other people pick it up, right? Because it has to be sort of a more broad. I don't want to call it movement, but I hope it becomes a practice that we cultivate.
I agree. Just very briefly, I think there's a great value in it. I hope this isn't the only chance that I personally have, for example, for many reasons, but just a few. As I said, these can be, in general, generative of new ideas, and not just capturing, oh, you thought this, now, great, save, print, sell it on t-shirts. It's not static and done. There's certainly, in my own experience, of feedback, and also just in the process of articulating it with one or more than one kind of partner or interlocutor, that will often help surface assumptions I hadn't realized I was making. What had I tacitly been thinking about that can only come out really from this kind of trained dialogue, let's say. So in that sense, and thirdly, and maybe as Tracy was saying earlier as well, if all these are in some sense metaphors or analogies, those are always partial. So we're never going to be done. And so what's the work to say, well, what's the refinement? This beautifully evokes this important critical part that I had in my mind, but it doesn't really convey this other part. And that turns out to be now important for the next stage of my scientific questions. So, right, so again, we're not sort of done now with any of these projects. And so in that sense, helping to articulate or surface some assumptions that have been overlooked or whatever, I think that process itself is bound to be valuable. And this is, I think, a pretty effective way to make sure that we're not just sort of running on our unexamined sets of what already worked last time.
It's also fun.
It's
Yeah,
also fun.
it
I
is
should have led with that. That's true.
And I would say, yeah, I mean, I agree, like, it's valuable for all the reasons that you guys have mentioned. I do think there's a context in which it's possible to, well, I'm a phenomenologist, which means that I do theory but try to connect to data. So
Very different phenomenology.
Different phenomenology.
Right.
But, you know, and I do think that it is possible for physicists to introspect in the absence of data and go off down some pretty misleading pathways. I think we have some examples from the history of physics of that happening. So I mean, you know, for me, like this is not something that could replace data. Like, I mean, in my field for dark matter, we have tons of ideas for what dark matter could be. The thing allowing us to distinguish between some of these ideas is not going to be a better understanding of what we're doing. It's going to be information from the universe about what it's really doing. But of course, there are many examples of cases where we build an experiment to do one thing, and by people just thinking about, okay, like how might we repurpose this? What if we drop these other assumptions about what we're looking for? What if, you know, we thought about this in a different way, figuring out entirely new things that you can do with those experiments. So I mean, there are sort of some pretty so while I don't think it can be just introspection going forward.
Right.
There are certainly a number of pretty concrete ways in which, you know, better communication between people and better ability to figure out what assumptions that we're making and how we might modify it could have pretty concrete benefits for physics, I think.
I think we have time for
One
a
more?
question or two.
Yeah.
So, go
So
ahead.
this was touched on a little bit, but Tracy, you talked about how your default imagination of dark matter is still as this black stuff out there. How do you go about changing the way that your default imagination perceives something once you get new information coming in? And do you think that art could be a medium to actually try and change that default? Because it's quite hard once you get this really strong picture of dark matter in there, and you get this new information every time you go to think about it, you're still imagining.
Yeah, and
matter.
there, well, right. So yes, I think art can help change. And when I give talks, I try to say, like, we say dark matter, but really it's transparent matter. Like, we draw these sort of dark scaffoldings, but you should imagine, like, crystalline dark matter out there in the universe. So, you know, I try to say in talks. But, I mean, there's also sort of a question of how much does it matter, right? Like, I mean, if it's easier for me to visualize stuff in my head if it has different colors, even if physically it doesn't have different colors, then maybe that's still a useful tool for my internal understanding of the problem. You know, even if, you know, so long as I know that this is a representation, and that then maybe that's okay. But I think I guess the case where I feel that changing your intuition is more important, because if you rely on your baseline intuition, it will steer you wrong in ways that are much less predictable than I need to remember that dark matter is not actually purple. Is stuff like going from your intuition about how kinematics works, like how projectile motion works and stuff, from non-relativistic physics to relativistic physics, right? And that's a case where I think we spend, again, I think of this because I've taught undergrad special relativity, but in those classes we spend a ton of time basically trying to teach people how to update their intuition. And we do this with space-time diagrams, and we do it with example problems, and we do it by getting people to think about paradoxes, to try to hammer into them, like, okay, these are assumptions you've made all your life, you can't make them anymore, and if you make them and don't realize you're making them, you will get things wrong. So yeah, maybe there's a way in that context to use more visual media or more other media to try to help people with updating their intuition, or in other contexts where it's not something that we teach in undergrad classes, like places we need to update our intuition that we haven't realized yet.
Can I just add to that? I think the intuition breaks down even before you get to relativity. In introductory physics and mechanics, position is easy, velocity is easy, but acceleration gets tricky, right, as a vector.
Okay.
And then students have all sorts of, they're more along the Aristotelian physics.
Yes.
Sure. Just
intuitions.
Aristotle versus Galileo is, I guess, the first place where people are like, wait, really?
Yeah.
Things
And even things
accelerate
like
at the same
momentum.
rate,
You don't have an
independent of
intuition
their
for
mass.
momentum. It's not something you can point to. So
But I guess the context in relativity is you think you've got this totally harmless assumption, like if two events happen at the same time from the perspective of one observer, then they'll happen at the same time from the perspective of all observers. And that turns out to be wrong in our universe. And yeah, like again, when I taught undergrad relativity, we had sort of like weeks of problem sets where in every problem set, there's another problem, which the problem is that if you do it the naive way and you assume that events happen at the same time for both observers, you just get a completely wrong answer that doesn't make any sense. And at least when I taught the class, every time it usually took like several iterations for students to start to realize, despite being explicitly told what the problem was, for students to start to internalize, no, I really can't make this assumption no matter how
this is
sensible
why
it seems.
space-time diagrams are helpful.
Yes, exactly.
kind of
So-
have
and that's
these
a visual representation.
Yeah.
So I think that's a perfect place to end
Great.
this conversation, which will continue in some way. So thank you so much for your thoughts and diagrams and so on. And thank you, audience, for being here and for questions. And just to let you know, working on the spring season, so check our website for updates. And if you haven't donated to Catalyst recently, we would love you to do that to help us keep this work going. So, and we wish you a peaceful Thanksgiving. So thank you.